Our attention is the clearest indicator of where we're getting our pleasure from. Interesting, the story of Narcissus, the man who fell in love with his own reflection at the pool, that eventually fell in. It's an interesting tale, because it holds some interesting truths. The thing about that tale is that it doesn't actually tell you what happens to Narcissus after he falls in the pool. And they can speculate that he drowned. It tells us a lot about who we are as creatures, that we do actually come with built-in ability to generate our own joy completely independently of the rest of the social organism. He outgrows the need to even justify himself. He outgrows the need to even defend himself. He outgrows his own dreams, so content in himself. Like everything he wants or desires is in him. And he's so in love with himself and believes he's amazing so much that he basically doesn't need any validation at all from anyone. A festering, profound curiosity in himself. So much so that it basically really bothers everyone. I think it makes everyone really, really angry at him. It's such a foreign paradigm to everyone. The only similar story throughout history that I can really trace back to that has any similarities to this paradigm is the story of Diogenes, the dog philosopher. He defaces their currency so much that basically they exile him. He defaces their values, their currency, their meaning. He defaces their meaning so much that he becomes exiled. He looks deep enough into his own eyes that he unlocks basically a power in himself through his intimate obsessings in isolation. At the heart of it, the seed is his curiosity with himself. Like he finds himself so fascinating and so enthralling and addictive that he almost basically never leaves himself alone. And so his world becomes shaped, I think, in a completely different way. This unbelievable degree of intimacy with himself. It's like he becomes his own best friend. He befriends his own mind. He gets so intimate with himself that he basically falls in love with himself, like actual love, like the same romantic love you'd feel for a woman, the same passionate romantic love you'd feel for a woman. He basically feels for himself, a full-blown romantic love affair. It's not a boastful, prideful love that's trying to lord over anyone. It's that he actually falls literally in love with himself. I think it's the best thing that could really ever happen to someone, is that he falls head over heels in love with himself. I think that's the most beautiful love affair that I think anyone can ever have. Like what he was doing just felt so significant that it was just enough to capture his attention constantly, and his thoughts basically just became addicted to himself. It's fascinating. There's this really intimate, isolated reality that can be developed by just this sheer intimacy with his thought and with his character. And he just becomes this total focal point, like the center of the universe, a star. If we're dopamine creatures, we're governed by
if our actions and our lives are wholly governed by the dopaminergic systems in our brain and in our bodies that basically guide us to things that we want to do, get us addicted to certain activities. If a man harnessed those mechanisms in himself, he basically learns how to leverage himself with that mechanism so that he knows how to basically use that mechanism on command. But other people basically don't have that ability to do that. They don't know themselves enough. They don't know themselves enough to basically do that. And so end up basically just subject to the world. They end up subject to the world. Entirely subject to their surroundings. And what's going on around them governs their mood, governs their dopamine supply. But they actually have total control over their own supply. And they could actually control it intrinsically pretty easily once they got a hang of it and understood themselves well enough. They live their lives basically completely subject to circumstance, of will, of other people, other people's realities. But they don't really have a choice because they don't know how to use their own dopamine mechanics. And the narcissist basically, I think, taps into that. The narcissist taps into the dopamine carrier system. He learns basically how to get the joys from himself and so becomes invested in himself. He understands the system in himself. He learns that dopamine system in himself. He learns all the triggers. He learns all the defense mechanisms in his mind. Our attention is the clearest indicator of where we're getting our pleasure from. And if he's actually just so obsessed with himself, it's because he's actually getting joy out of it. He's getting an intrinsic joy, an intrinsic bliss that he's generating himself. And it's I think it does come down to the science in a way. He understands the mechanics of his dopamine generating system. He masters it and understands all the triggers, how it works, what triggers it, what doesn't, and basically paints himself into a world where he is his sole source of pleasure. It's really difficult to penetrate his world unless you're really, really significantly pleasurable. Unless the dopamine you're offering him, unless it's significantly high and able to compete with his own system, then you're almost not privy to his attention. So he becomes increasingly isolated, I think, and self-obsessed, to the point in which he relieves himself of the world. And that is essentially what the teacher knows. The role of the teacher is to guide the student through these dopamine like gates, so that the child jumps through the hoops to get the treat. And once he becomes the teacher and can basically monitor himself and teach himself as efficiently as a master coach, he not only excels faster and learns faster, but he learns with more joy and basically gets to a place where chemically he becomes the alchemist of his own mind. And as it acquires more language, he acquires more raw material to basically alchemically conjure these feelings, to conjure these drugs like in his brain, he becomes the alchemist of the drugs in his brain to basically keep him perpetually high, and knows how to basically taper off the lows and how to prolong the highs. He masters the alchemy of his brain so that he's entirely self-sustaining and internally and intrinsically completely self-sufficient. The alchemist is a mastermind. What's a mastermind? It's a man who's mastered his mind. It's an alchemical mastery of his brain, of the mechanics of his brain, and all of its chemical systems and its myelinating procedures in order to maximize and optimize his joy, his ability to generate his own joy and defend himself against others' strife. It's so important. It's probably the most important set of skills anyone could ever learn. It can be taught and talked about to some extent, like externally, but the process all happens internally. It's completely internal. He must become his master coach. He must become the ultimate teacher of himself. He knows how to leverage time for the student, which can only happen by basically really knowing himself so well and becoming so self-indulged. He masters himself, that he masters his own mind, and then he's free. Our attention is the clearest indicator of where we're getting our pleasure from.